introduce you to my channel about everyday life of an Aspie. If you're following me right now, I'm AspieAnswersAll. I'm all about creating mental health and awareness versus sharing my life stories of Asperger's syndrome, OCD and the like. And also sharing my life stories, also basically of taking you on a journey of some mental health and awareness series that I feel to address right now, as well as some tips and advice with those mental health series, which is with some encouragement and whatnot to share with you all, regardless what it may be that you guys are struggling with, to let you know that you're not alone. And not further ado, guys, basically at this point of time, I'm trying to finish up what I can right now of the Let's Talk series, even though this one's going to be a lot of, different topics that will be included in here, be it education, special needs education, housing, health, and the like. Basically, it will be covering up all those topics based on what goes on in New Zealand, and hopefully we can actually address these issues and solve these somehow together as a team. We need to. So what I've covered so far in the last part of the series was basically, and which was part one, I talked about, real briefly about the Human Rights Act of New Zealand, what it is, the purpose of it, and the acts, inside the acts, what it covers. I also talked about the barriers that children come and face with the ones with special needs, or shall we say with disabilities, even though I don't like using that word, but then again maybe we should just change it to special needs anyway, so I humbly apologise in advance. The definitions and key terms that are used, that keeps interchanging a lot, like it does when I've briefly mentioned so many times before that I stress that with the term of Asperger's syndrome and everything else, or other terms that comes into our way of it all. Also talked about basically also, despite that, I talked about some of the issues that are being faced with people with disabilities, and the main key factors, be it financial and just other bits like children trying to get into schools when they're mainstreamed, and the limitations of it based on the numbers that they have to have in schools in their local area of what they do and the like. So basically now I'm up to part 2, episode 2 of this part of my series, which is going to cover the overview of the barriers and harms that students with disabilities may face, in the education sector, as well as hopefully a few recognisations. So in all further ado, guys, basically I hope that in all honesty that while you've been following me step by step with these Let's Talk series, that you're learning something every day, and hopefully that every day is a new day for you to learn something new. So let's begin this part 2, episode 2 right now. If the education system doesn't provide young people with special education needs, however, the knowledge, skills and attitudes they need to achieve independence and success after they leave school, the cost to society will be far greater in the long term in terms of unemployment benefits, welfare payments, the cost of criminal justice systems and the like, which is now slowly how I look at it, evolving right now with what's happening there, about bits and pieces of certain, people with specialised needs. They're not getting them accommodation met, be it, their health care versus their education, versus sometimes they're not given fair treatment in a way of terms of employment also, and sometimes, it's just kind of hard that, they young people with disabilities especially, obviously, are currently experiencing exclusion, not just in education, however, as I've said, from the education system itself, but also in other myriad of different situations, be it in terms of employment versus basically they're getting excluded in the way of the terms of healthcare and everything else. In some parts, some of it will, like I said, have been finding it hard to maybe find their ends meet in the way of terms of health and everything else that needs to be done with it. Sometimes this will lead to long-term risk, however. Okay, got to remember though, with how I've been talking about youth law, Aotearoa, basically what I've researched has noted that the figures that they've seen basically has increased largely since 2015 about, learning and intellectual disabilities. That forms the largest proportion of the number, with a notably high number of cases involving ADHD or attention deficit hyperactive disorder and autism spectrum disorder or ASD. As they noted in the report, however, that the figures and statistical data may be partially attributed to the greater knowledge of their, services among the relevant support networks for children and young people around New Zealand. Even though, like I said before, with some people with special needs, some of the, accommodation, or shall we say, support services are briefly limited here in New Zealand, and it needs to be more of it. But then again, as I said before, that maybe it's just the lack of funding, lack of awareness, understanding, lack of training from people that are trying to be training in that specialised field, regardless what it may be. Hopefully in due time, due course, that there will be growing numbers of, support for them. There are growing emphasis, however, has been placed on intellectual disabilities and neurodisabilities, reflecting the wider transformation of the composition of disability since 1979. Okay, childhood emotional, behavioural and neurological disabilities have in fact become more prevalent than the physical disabilities, however. As I'm addressing this, hopefully in New Zealand facts alone, hopefully not just UK or US facts and statistics, bear with me, since I'm based in New Zealand, so I apologise, but hopefully you guys can get a brief outline of what I'm addressing here, especially. As we know, basically in New Zealand, just over about half, 52% of the children with disabilities are also identified as having a learning disability, and around those percentile range, 39% are identified as having a psychological or psychiatric disability. For around 1/5, 21% of the children with disabilities, a psychological or psychiatric disability is also their main disability that they face with every day and try to cope with. These changes may indicate great awareness and shifting, however, to diagnostic labellings of disabilities, right? Be it whatever it may be, dyslexic, ADHD, autism, special syndrome, and the like of these labels that we have, or diagnostics. A child formerly considered distractible may now be considered diagnosable by parents, teachers and health professionals, however. It is also more likely to be an increased knowledge of these conditions, as well as the need for specific diagnosis to receive services such as early intervention. So like I said before, the earlier the intervention, the better for the prevention of certain things, but we can't always know what goes down, because some of the, like I said so many times before, some of these conditions overlap with one another and they actually, work with one another. Education systems, however, will need to adapt to this changing landscape of the disability in order to uphold any of the meaningful right to inclusive education, because as I said before, inclusive education or inclusion is important, obviously, to a point, but then again, it has its downfalls like anything else when we weigh up the pros and cons of everything we need to address, regardless what it may be. Law Aotearoa's own experience of special education related cases is reflected in other forms of research that they've done. However, there are myriad ways in which students with disabilities may experience exclusion, which is including the following. What they stated was being denied of the enrolment and or full-time attendance of school, being denied access to and participation within the curriculum, whatever activities that is given to the child, they'll be excluded from that, even though, as we know, that kids want to feel accepted, wanted and appreciated, like anyone obviously, regardless of disabilities or not, so to speak. They may then become a victim to the bullies, so they're being bullied, inappropriate teacher and or principal beliefs and practices in relationship to the funding, a lack of caring, valuing and responsibility by school staff, lack of empathy, as well as all these other supports that needs to be put into place and practice for those type teachers or school staff. Obviously, there's limited understanding and knowledge and know-how of certain everyday disabilities, regardless what it may be. As I said before, sometimes that, some teachers will just focus on trying to teach as many kids in the classroom, regardless what it may be, and that in due course it just tends to happen that, some of the other ones will fall between the cracks because of it, and we need to, like I said, make ends meet somehow. Poor relationships between the parents and school staff, and then there's exclusionary beliefs and practices in relation to the teacher aides. In recent study notes, however, there has been still persistent barriers in relation to the accessibility, availability, adaptability and acceptability of education for people with specialised needs. Intellectual needs, ASD and behavioural needs were most commonly cited, however, as the main area for the need of children who had experienced these barriers to inclusion in schools. Specific barriers to availability identified by families included teachers not being knowledgeable about the special needs of children, a lack of funding, a lack of teacher aid time, and poor attitudes of both class teachers and school principals as well as maybe students as well. In some cases, families noticed that resources resorted to privately funding the support necessary to meet the needs of their own children. The lack of teaching knowledge often included issues around teachers failing to recognise the needs and support to meet them, obviously. Teachers holding the outdated deficit model thinking and teachers setting high expectations for disabled children. Obviously in some schools they have some everyday curriculum that they need to follow and abide by. Like I said before, sometimes it feels like we're living in a world of TOCs, terms of condition, basically, and sometimes we need to break away from it. Okay, just to be a note, another statistic here is, just under 1/3 of all children, 32% with a mental or emotional disability have an unmet need for help with schoolwork, indicating that they need more help and support with schoolwork than what they are currently receiving. Around a quarter of all those children with disabilities, which are the 24 percentile range, have the same unmet needs. 13% have an unmet need for special equipment to help with schoolwork, and 28% have an unmet need for adapted classroom materials. So what I'm meaning here is obviously all these needs to be met of the specialised equipment if they had any to learn with, be it certain application software that may talk to them, some specialised whiteboard interaction tool or whatever it may be. So another one is here though, teacher and peer bullying acts as barriers also to qualify or to a quality education that conforms to the basic human rights standards. As I said before, human rights, I mentioned that everyone has the right to education regardless of the age, gender, age, grade or creed. Many families identify issues around the adaptability of schools to the best interests of disabled children, noting an absence of policies to support inclusion, as well as inadequate adaptation of the school environment and resources. Okay, basically that previously the independent monitoring mechanism on the rights of persons with disabilities basically has noted that access to funding and services continues to be a common thing among education-related complaints to the Ombudsman. In 2012 and 13, however, I'm going to brief it down so now you guys should know the Independent Mentoring Mechanism, IMM. So the IMM noted that the main category of complaint about government activity to the HRC related to the treatment of disability in all sectors of education. A lack of reasonable accommodation and unfair expulsions, exclusions, stand-downs dominated education-related complaints, however. Moreover, neurodisabilities make young people more vulnerable in the justice system for reasons including different degrees of comprehension and social discomfort due to low reading age, limited literacy skills, slower cognitive processing speeds and comprehension, impaired or heightened auditory and visual perception, poor short-term memory, and variable concentration, reduced ability to understand procedures and follow instructions, and the list goes on. Right, the analysis of the key issues that are addressed here, however, of this is as follows. Okay, so the purpose of it, what broadly are they people of youth law is trying to achieve within the special needs of education. Okay, it looks at the bigger picture, hopefully. Policy issues relating to the role of the central government and the Ministry of Education in attempting to put some perspective on how New Zealand education policies has developed in the last few decades. We will obviously need to observe some of these, making some observations of the issues that are obviously identified here and what I've related to here in the current policy of what has been addressed by Youth Law, Aotearoa and all these other people that are staying. And then obviously with Youth Law, Aotearoa, they are trying to look for an alternative approach and answer to how we can address these. So obviously, number one of it is the current pragmatic approach to policy. Special Education 2000 basically was first conceived as a cohesive framework with an identified singular purpose, which obviously was in their curriculum or outline of its of their purpose was to provide support for students with special educational needs in a mainstream school setting. After the implementation of policies, however, was identified, there were actually several issues that arose from this, particularly in relation to the perceived inadequacy of funding support. So obviously, it's always revolving around, as you keep hearing from me out, is all about the funding, lack of funding to it. While the Ministry has commissioned many reports over the past decade, however, which have made various recommendations, the Ministry has not publicised documentation of their response or position in relation to the reports that I'm introducing to you all today of what's been going down. It appears that while some recommendations were followed, however, others were completely ignored. The Independent Monitoring Mechanism on the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has recently raised concern of the fact that despite drastic policy changes in relation to special education provision, there have been no amendments to the Education Act of 1989 of New Zealand in relation to special education for the last 2 decades. So, yeah. It appears to the Youth Law, Aotearoa and other, ministry rights of New Zealand needs to obviously look into the budgetary concerns that has been the driving our education policy rather than a child-centred policy of education, maybe. Okay. Another one to look at is conflict between policy positions. Okay, or shall we say conflict between inclusive education policy and fiscal restraint. Since the onset of the Success for All, Every School, Every Child's policy initiatives was introduced in 2010 in New Zealand, the Ministry of Education has been focusing more attention on the adoption of a fully inclusive education system across all around New Zealand schools, however. But the idea was operated as every child, regardless of their individual ability or needs, should have access to education at their local school without being required to attend a special school. The incorporation concepts of inclusive education, however, from the idea of it, was based in the adoption of the ministries in 1991. Special Education in New Zealand Statement of Intent as a part of the focus since 2010, though, the Ministry has adopted stronger language around inclusiveness, setting the target of attaining a full inclusive education system by 2014, allocating additional funding towards to support schools, and has undertaken a series of reviews by the Education Review Office of New Zealand for the purpose of measuring progress. Also, basically, they tend to argue, however, that despite the changes in their rhetoric and positive intentions of the Ministry in New Zealand in relation to inclusion, basically the Ministry's policy hasn't gone yet too far for this, or far enough. So what they should address here is, as a solution maybe, is increasing responsibility has been placed on schools to provide the necessary skills and support to students, but without significant investment to increasing funding to schools to enable the capacity and capability to do this. There is still a large gap, however, between the desired outcome of the inclusive educational provision of support that is required to achieve this. Obviously, there has been tension. Another one is tension between a narrowly accommodated vision of education and the broader vision with the UNCRPD, right? As I said before, basically, Currently, our school performance is predominantly measured by the reported progress of students against national standards, which basically the national standards I'm talking about here in New Zealand was, as I brought out basically in one of my videos that I'm bringing out, is about NCEA, which I'm going to be sharing more in that piece about that, if it's going well for students or not. NCEA, we know that every student is different in their terms of learning experience and just learning in general. The stated assumption with the national standards, however, is that all students' progress is able to be measured against the same benchmarks, which is not 100% true, because as I said just now, every student learns differently. And that with the right support, students should be able to perform the same level. For some students with additional learning needs, these assumptions may be correct to a point, and the standards could provide valid measurement of the progress given the right learning environment and support system in place, be it between the teachers and the students. For other students, however, with additional learning needs, especially those with higher needs, these standards may be an inappropriate way to measure their, success rate, and provide an accurate reflection of the quality of education provided by the school and just the students' progress. Okay, there has been like a part about the Tomorrow Schools model on basis that the school competition, which has been promoted, has driven schools away from cooperation and collaboration, has harmed the movement towards inclusive education because students with additional learning needs place a disadvantage burden on the school. But regardless of whether this is true or not of this finding, it does follow logically the competition doesn't work to incentives of particular outcomes such as the adoption of these inclusive values that they truly put into place. Another issue here to look at is confusion between concepts of inclusion and integration. The current education system we have here in New Zealand still produces somewhat mixed results when it comes to fully inclusive education, however. Many schools can and do provide meaningful education and inclusion, but for some schools, students with disabilities, however, can still be seen as a burden or liability to everyone around them. And obviously, for some of us, we are put in that bubble or label mentality that they don't want to touch us or they just don't want to teach us, whatever it may be for their particular reasoning. Inclusion in the mainstream environment doesn't necessarily mean inclusion into meaningful education, however, just to norms. The traditional medical model of disability tends to create a dichotomy between those that are normally able and those that are disabled. This is however problematic. The reasoning behind this is because it conflates the presence of a spectrum of abilities and needs present within all students and risks schools taking a narrow view of identifying which students need the support and which don't. This is a particular risk if a student doesn't have an identifiable or diagnosed disability, however, or has a disability which is less visible. So obviously what I'm saying here is basically every child with special needs will have maybe a disability that's not seen to, like I said, invisible disability. So if you want to know more what I'm talking about the disability, I recommend you guys to see the one about invisible disability so you can understand more to what I'm saying here. In the experience of some teachers, or shall we say, with what Ep2 has been saying, despite the understanding of the connection between certain disabilities such as autism spectrum disorder or ASD and the corresponding emotional behavioural symptoms, schools can still perceive this kind of behaviour as disobedience rather than attributing it to the student's individual needs. This can lead to an unfair disciplinary action or even just exclusion or expulsion from schools, which has obviously been given true. In 2002, however, Dr. Kathy Wiley has pointed out that there has been a failure to challenge the assumption that students identified with special needs, high special needs especially, I should say, require a totally different pedagogical response to students with the least needs for support. Another one is that the appreciate schools can feel under-equipped for the complexities of the role of delivering education to all types of learners, not just, able bodies, but all people. But then they submit this as a reflection to their educational system here in New Zealand has not yet come far enough in adapting to become a system for all students with all the different learning needs and styles. Another one is medical dichotomy of disability also tends to oversimplify causal factors in student achievement. Students tend to be categorized into sometimes arbitrary groups such as disabled, lower socioeconomic class, gifted, etc., etc. The list goes on. And this, however, often has implications for how the student is viewed by the educational system in New Zealand, as well as how they are supported through the system of the education versus the system through teachers, parents, and the like. What is needed for the classroom environment is to be more reflexive and responsive to the student rather than expecting the student to adapt to a space that doesn't suit them. Okay, another one is basically a values-based approach, which is at present there has been a lot of educational debate, which is mainly about ways and means. It should probably be about purpose, vision and goals to be set out and actually, achieve these. Okay, the recommendations basically is reform policy for educational support for students with disabilities starting from a values and rights-based framework. Okay, practice and provision, what should learning support services look like is the question that many people may ask. One of the key ideas basically, the Ministry of Education of New Zealand has adopted some of the principles of inclusive education with the introduction of special education in 2000. Evolving a clearer, firmer stance on inclusion. Since then, not enough work has been done to create the necessary supporting infrastructure within the education system, basically, of New Zealand to make special education in a mainstream setting work for all students. Some of this part of my video hopefully will briefly highlight some of the areas or barriers to the New Zealand educational system, adopting hopefully a more inclusive culture, and obviously discussing some strategies that can be put into place to address these barriers, and I'm about to introduce. Okay, number one is lack of guidance and procedural frameworks for educational support. As we know, what I just said before, the view that schools' attitudes toward including and supporting the education of children with additional learning needs is inherently a cultural issue informed by a number of underlying factors, including a clash of ideologies towards disability in education, a lack of clear guidance and oversight by the Ministry of Education and by concerns as well as competing interests over funding. In 2007, however, the Ministry did revise the New Zealand curriculum, which then resulted in major changes. Basically what happened here was, in that year, research has been done by the New Zealand Council for Educational Research, found that schools' values most closely aligned with the new curriculum were significantly quicker to adopt and implement it. It was then clearly shown or understood that the facilitating of the cultural shift within the education sector has been further adopted out. The inclusive values will be important if the education sector is also fully adopted into the inclusive practice. Current education system doesn't systematically encourage inclusive practice is number two. Okay, as I've discussed, the view that true inclusive education requires an education system that isn't grounded on the assumption that there are normal paths to student learning or levels of student achievements. Basically, that is important. Again, in 2007, the new curriculum set out further expectation that educators will be aware of and respond to the diverse needs of students, will make use of a range of pedagogical practices and engage in reflexive professional development. In 2011, however, the New Zealand Teachers Council, now called the Education Council, amended the requirements for initial teacher education programs to include a new requirement that graduating teachers should have knowledge and skills relating to the provision of inclusive education for students with disabilities. Despite these changes, however, there has been still clashes of values within the education system between the more traditional view that education is purpose to produce high academic results and the broader view of education enshrined with the UNCROC and UNCRPD. Basically, I may not believe that the current system caters well for some students. They don't see these as being, necessarily mutually exclusive aims, but are concerned that a few measures of successful schools relating to achievement outcomes that relate to including students with additional learning needs who may not always achieve highly academically for what the teachers would like to see. Okay, hopefully, even though I'm running low of time, I'll do briefly the recommendations in some parts, hopefully. even though there's quite a few, or shall we leave it as that? Maybe I'll leave it as that. Recommendations, basically, I will actually do it now. Actually, okay, the two recommendations that I need to look at is Parliament. Is number one, Parliament make amendments to the Education Act of 1989 of New Zealand to include a statement on the purpose of education in line with Articles 29 of those two abbreviated things of UNCROC and of UNCRPD, which I'll hopefully write this description what it is about while I'm running out of time. The Ministry to investigate, number two, this is ways to exemplify skills that perform well in relation to the use of diverse approaches to learning and inclusive practices. Okay, as we know, basically, due to the lack of clear expectations for schools, despite a range of policy references to inclusive practice in the school of students with disabilities over the last 15 years or so, there has still been an absence of any formalised framework of expectations with respect to the school's role in this area. These are not codified, however, and do not have the status or effect of primary or secondary legislations. So basically, again, it's not going far enough. Okay, the Ministry of Education, however, has also published a series of guidelines for schools or inclusive practices, which may provide helpful direction and advice for schools, but essentially retains the core problem of being framed as guidance rather than expectations. Okay, to note here in particular, there is the absence of as the following. Number one, a concrete definition of inclusive education or explicit policy position on the role of mainstream versus specialised schools. Number two, procedures or guidelines on the identification of those who have needs. Number three, guidelines on which students in schools are expected to provide additional support to. Number four is procedures for a graduated response by the school. Number five is procedures around keeping records on the release of information to families. Number six, procedures around creating and reviewing individual education plans or IEPs. And number six, or shall we say number seven, requirement for schools to involve families. So basically this is going to have to end here, obviously, and I'll continue on for these recommendations in part 2B. Obviously, give me the like for thumbs up for support, comment below if need be, challenge me if you need to, feel free to actually, share these videos around to family and friends, hopefully, so that we can get a key understanding to what's going on. Feel free to also basically follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Feel free to subscribe to my channel, since I'm hoping to try and see if I can upload on the daily, which I can't always guarantee that, but just keep an eye out on it anyway, regardless of what I've shared with you briefly. If you've been watching my video about the change of circumstances, regardless what it is, but like I said, I'll be here and there touching base with you all anyway, like I do when I can, sort of thing, in my binge watching. Thanks for the support, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you all again soon.